Finally, we have the Edwin Sutherland Award. I just couldn't be more pleased than to announce Professor Kathleen Daly as this year's recipient of the Sutherland Award. This award is given to recognize outstanding scholarly contributions to theory or research in criminology. A luminary, and I don't use that word lightly, a luminary in the field, Kathleen Daly is Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University in Brisbane. She is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, the ASC, of course, she's a Fellow, and the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology, and she is a member of the Australian Commonwealth Independent Advisory Council on Redress. She's received many, many awards. I will cite two in particular. The ASC Hindling Award for Gender Crime and Punishment. That's how I first got to know Professor Daly's work. And the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology Alder Book Prize for redressing institutionalized abuse of children. The nominators, who recommended that we add the Sutherland Award to Professor Daly's accolades, really emphasized, I think rightly so, the breadth and scope of her work. Here's how they explained it to the board. Throughout her career, Professor Daly has undertaken pioneering work in emerging fields of knowledge. She sets the agenda by distilling the strengths and limits of past work, introducing new concepts and theorizations, carrying out empirically rigorous and imaginative projects, and venturing into contentious and uncharted waters. In this way, she has shaped the contours and trajectories of 4 fields of criminological inquiry: feminist criminology, restorative justice and indigenous justice, justice responses to sexual and violent victimization, and redress for institutional abuses of children. The scale, depth, and adventurousness of her scholarship are inspirational, leading the way with conceptual clarity and path-breaking research. Now, I would like to just point out 2 pillars of this body of work. Professor Daly is renowned for her truly path-breaking and agenda-setting work on gender, race, and gender, race, and crime and restorative justice. Her gender, crime, and punishment framework challenged traditional criminological theories by highlighting the intersectionality of gender and justice. Her research on restorative justice has also been transformative. Professor Daly's studies have provided critical insights into how restorative practices can offer more equitable and effective solutions for both victims and those who have committed offenses. Here's a tidbit. Her body of work includes 25 publications that's been reprinted, a few 7 to 9 times, and 8 have been translated into Chinese, Dutch, French, Korean, Serbian, and Spanish. The reach and impact is quite stunning. Here's an unobtrusive measure of her impact that came to me while I was working on these comments. I mentioned to a collaborator, Stefan Vogler, an early career scholar, that Kathy Daly is receiving the Sutherland Award. Here's what he wrote back to me over email. Her feminist criminology work has been inspiring and so generative for me as a queer scholar looking to bring new insights on gender and sexuality into the field of criminology. Lucky for me, Professor Daly has already laid that foundation, and I'm fortunate enough to get to build on it. I wrote back, lucky you indeed, lucky us. Professor Daly's influence extends beyond generations of scholars. She's been a passionate advocate to ensure the marginalized voices are heard within the criminal justice system, the legal system. Her dedication to equity and her innovative approaches, I think, are well known and admired. Her legacy is not only found in her prolific body of work, but in the countless numbers of people, myself included, who have been inspired by that work and count themselves as next generation Daly folks. Professor Daly's commitment to excellent research and to fostering more inclusive and a just society continues to resonate throughout the global community. I'm going to share something with you before I close. In anticipation of making this introduction, I wrote to Kathy. She kept signing off Kathy, so I thought I'm going to call her Kathy. I asked Kathy, what are you most proud of in light of your incredible list of accomplishments? What do you see as your most important work and impact? She replied, "It's difficult for me to point to any one work that I am most proud of. It is more about the approach I take on ideas, research, and how to communicate the two. Ultimately, the aim is to produce useful, practical knowledge to a wide audience." By the way, later she elaborated in a note that I'm going to keep just for me, okay? Buy me a drink, I might share. Let me conclude so you can hear from our honoree. Simply put, Professor Kathleen Daly embodies the spirit of the Sutherland Award through her exemplary scholarship, her commitment to justice, and her transformative impact on the field. Please join me in congratulating Professor Kathleen Daly, the recipient of the Sutherland Award 2024.
Isn't Val fantastic? She has such energy and sincerity in giving the awards, and everyone was put in the sun to shine or to bask in the sun, and I think they're very grateful for your lovely introduction and award giving. So thank you, Val, for that. I'm going to begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of what is now called the San Francisco Peninsula. I also pay my respects to Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, and to those who have stewarded this land through the generations. I hope there are some First Nations people here. Unfortunately, I haven't seen too many sessions on this topic, except from my colleagues in Australia, but there's a lot we share. Now, I wrote these remarks and the title of the remarks itself way back in June before the election. And we didn't know the election until last week. The remarks don't speak to the election, I'm afraid. However, I think the second part does have a bearing for those who want to pick up on it. So, let me start. We often hear that people are fighting for justice or seeking justice. And we hear anger and disappointment. I didn't get justice. There was no justice. Academic writers say that justice in the real world can never be fully achieved, or our hands are tied before we begin. How do we make sense of the different claims for justice and about justice? How do we click this forward may be the better question. There we go. It clicked forward more than I needed to. You're getting a little bit of reprise here. There we go. So tonight my talk reflects on the term justice as it is used in academic writings on wrongs against individuals, targeted groups, and large-scale victimization, all three, not just individuals. And here I note two problems. First, analysts do not say what their referent is to justice. It may be to criminal justice, other justice mechanisms, the elimination of injustice, societal change, distributive justice, or something else. The second problem is that except for philosophers, analysts do not describe their conception or idea of justice. So tonight I address those two problems. First, I propose a way to decipher claims or arguments about justice, and then I present what I see as a promising idea of justice. So my argument in a nutshell is that criminology and allied justice fields need to develop more robust analyses of justice, which draw from philosophical argument, social theory, and empirical research. So let's get to the first part and deciphering justice. The voluminous literature on justice, I think, is disconnected. Let me tell you, I did a review of how many times the word justice appeared in the program for the ASC. It appeared 708 times. So this talk may be of some relevance, although it was maybe criminal justice and restorative justice. In any event, the voluminous literature on justice is disconnected. Philosophical arguments on a just society from centuries ago still dominate, but they have little connection to empirical work on justice in response to wrongs, which is what we typically study. One exception, of course, is theories of punishment, but these are often abstract and idealized. So in addition to not giving a referent to justice, analysts do not distinguish different levels at which theories, mechanisms, and research sit. All of it is called one thing: justice. So I see at least, and I say at least because I've just begun this analysis looking at levels in the last month or so, I see at least 3 levels operating, and here's the sociologist coming out in me, although these levels don't line up nicely with the way sociology does using these levels, except in a few places. These are macro, meso, and the meso-micro interface. So macro justice is a term created by a political theorist since deceased, Judith Shklar, to depict how justice is understood in philosophy. And when I use the term, I include not only that, but anyone who thinks of justice in a societal sense. Meso-justice comprises the institutions and mechanisms of justice, which are undergirded by legislation and law, and perhaps a few other things, but those are the main ones. And the meso-micro interface is individual or group capture by or engagement with meso-justice. So I'm going to look at each of these. On macro justice, I didn't need to move my page. I thought I did. For macro justice, philosophers mean justice itself. They just call it justice, but what they mean is distributive justice. That is how resources and opportunities ought to be allocated in a just society. You open any philosophy book, they don't even bother to define justice. They just say, here's my theory. It's kind of interesting. They don't even talk about level. John Rawls, a celebrated liberal philosopher, typifies macro justice. He wrote a book in 1971 that still reverberates strongly in the philosophy field, has a huge impact. He identified justice as fairness in the distribution of benefits and burdens to society members. In 1990, Iris Marion Young, a philosopher, a more critical philosopher, challenged his argument for what it assumed, that it was possible to identify universal principles, and many people have since said the same. So she challenged it for what it assumed and also for what it ignored, social groups and institutional decision-making. She said, sure, fair distribution was important, but it ignored the social structure and institutional context that determines distributive patterns. So she illustrates by bringing us to this scene in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. I'm afraid before some of you were born in this room, where, you remember that sign for those of you who were born several decades before the 1980s, where a sign says, "Peace, jobs, and justice." And she asks, "What does justice mean here?" And her response is, justice means the elimination of two forms of injustice: institutionalized domination and oppression. Jung's ideas, and this is my interpretation, reading other philosophical texts and understanding this period of time, that her ideas are part of a shift in philosophy that began in the 1980s. Other texts began to be saying the same thing, and in two ways. First, as I see it, using my levels analysis, greater movement among the three levels of macro, meso, and the micro levels. And another change that occurred beginning around this time was changing the philosophy question from what constitutes a just society to what is injustice, or how can we reduce injustice and advance justice. This shift, as I see it, provides openings in criminology and allied justice fields to bring in what people would call, and I would call, real-world philosophical argument. Meso-level justice holds a vast set of institutions with diverse functions in governing and regulating society. It includes not only state, but also state entities. And if there's a failure often in normative philosophy theorizing, it's only about the state often. I want to simplify with examples from criminal justice, civil justice with a reference to tort law, and alternatives to criminal justice, because of course there are many, many other institutions at the meso level. So formal criminal justice mechanisms are both proactive and reactive. Civil justice mechanisms are, for tort in particular, reactive. That is, the court is responding to claims. Alternatives to criminal justice, and I'll just give one example, restorative justice, are reactive and informal. Now, some might say they're embedded within formal systems, so they're, part of formal justice. But in general, I would call them a type of informal justice. And that is because they bring respected community members, victims, and family members of victims and admitted offenders into meso-level decision-making. Meso-level justice is personified by a woman in robes with a sword and scale. You'll see a picture shortly, just in case you forgot. She stands for equality, impartiality, fairness, and reason. Her role is juridical and reactive. She adjudicates and she dispenses punishment and recompense in the tort context. Apart from the 16th century, and only from the 16th century, she began to wear a blindfold. There's plenty of discussion about why the blindfold, and there's enough ambiguity there that books will be written on this for a long time. We know that a lot more is going on at the meso level than the woman with a blindfold. There are other types of things happening. Legal pluralism, emotion, and informality are all present. And this has fostered what George Pavlich called fragmented justice. I call it fragmented meso-justice. Now, that began in the 1970s or so, and it continues to the present. And last, we have the meso-micro interface. And this is individual or group capture by or engagement with meso-justice. Formal meso institutions and staff have different understandings of justice than those who are captured Many people in this room know this all too well. The two groups are adversaries more often than not. So for those who are captured, being part of that interface is quite unpleasant and uncomfortable. On the other hand, there's engagement with meso-justice, and this happens when any citizen, but I have in mind now victims of crime, call the police or go to court to report wrongs and conflict. But citizens do that as much as non-victim citizens do that as much, if not more. It also happens in another context when social movement and advocacy groups pursue claims of wrongs, including large-scale victimization by state and non-state entities. Now, I think you'll be glad that I leave this levels part of the analysis because it's not as exciting as the next part of the talk. But let me tell you why I am making this point about levels. It is, and observe your own use of the word justice to see if I'm borne out, that analysts move between them without an awareness of doing so. And you might say, well, so what? And I would say, well, I can't understand your argument. Are you talking about macro, meso, micro? What are you talking about? So the levels analysis is a bit boring, but it's a good diagnostic to figure out what are you talking about when you're talking about justice in your writing. Okay, so here is the woman we've been looking for. There she is. This is Themis, the Greek goddess. There's also the Roman goddess who came a few centuries later. And this was taken not by me, but by another photographer. And it's at the Brisbane Supreme and Superior Court, for those of you nostalgic for Brisbane at the moment. There she is standing in front of the courthouse, if you want to remember her. Okay, now we're going to be moving to the second part of my talk on the idea of justice. And I want you to listen up here because it will help, I think, you think about, well, what is my idea of justice? Well, for some time, I've observed empirical regularities in research on justice mechanisms and practices in criminal justice, civil justice, and alternatives such as restorative justice. There are limits on what the mechanisms, justice mechanisms can achieve, and by mechanisms, I mean, criminal justice, prosecution, all of that, as well as civil justice mechanisms. Gaps between stated goals and actual practices, and mixed findings on victims' or claimants' experiences with processes and outcomes. Now I'm going to put in a plug for my own current research. I hope you don't mind. It is on institutional justice. It analyzes state and church institutional abuse and neglect of children and associated historical policy wrongs. And by this, I mean forced assimilation as one example, forced assimilation of First Nations peoples and travelers, another really badly handled group during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is concerned with individual and large-scale victimization, and it uses multiple justice mechanisms of public investigation, criminal justice, civil justice, and redress schemes, which typically have a money payment, counseling, and apologies, and perhaps other elements. So this past year, I was developing a theoretical framework for institutional justice, and a first step I had to describe my conception of justice. I didn't have one. This was a challenging activity. That's why I want to share it with you. Like others, I had been using justice loosely, without reference to macro, meso, or micro levels, or distinguishing between justice mechanisms and a larger idea of justice. So I went searching for this larger idea. I considered justice as fairness and as balance, but both assumed victims as individuals. Again, this victimist focus on individuals is a bit of a problem as I see it in the field, in the sense of why we need to think a bit broader than that. They did not have large-scale victimization in mind. And they only had criminal justice in mind. Again, another lacuna as I see it in the justice field, in this field, but of course we are crime and justice, I guess. I also considered transitional justice, but for a variety of reasons, it was not a good fit. So I required another idea, and you will be surprised to learn from whom I drew. Enter Jacques Derrida and justice as a promise. Now, some of you will know Derrida, a postmodern philosopher, and in that respect, his ideas can be obscure and hard to follow. However, as I hope you'll see, the way he thought about justice rang true to me. He did not think a macro justice theory was possible. His argument was descriptive, fabulous, not normative. I much prefer descriptive theory for my purposes. He had in mind macro-meso interface, I believe, when you listen to the way he describes it, but how that related to the larger idea of justice. So using my levels analysis, I think he had in mind this struggle between the macro and meso activities and the relationship to the macro level. So here's a summary, and I owe a lot to George Pavlich, who distilled a good deal of Derrida in his 1996 book, and I'm just taking a little selection from it, but I'll get to Derrida also in a moment. So here goes. Listen up. It's not tough following, but listen up. Justice can be viewed as a promise, as an idea that forever reaches beyond any incarnations that bear its name. Justice is a mystical concept, never fully present, yet not entirely absent either. It is a vague idea of work that is done at the margins of that which is present. Justice is paradoxically located beyond given limits, but is part of the process through which such limits are addressed, sustained, challenged, enforced, etc. So Derrida put it this way: justice exceeds law and calculation. He uses calculation a lot, doesn't define it. I'll tell you how I define it in a moment. Justice exceeds law and calculation. And so incalculable justice requires us to calculate. Now, I just get shivers when I hear this. It's just so perfect, so perfect. So my interpretation: justice is beyond reach, but it has presence when people decide or debate where the boundary lies. It is elusive, but continually subject to calculation. I interpret calculation to be the plurality of rationales in law and legislation, and certainly if you're looking at civil justice, the calculations by insurance. Those are big in terms of civil claims. So applying these ideas to institutional justice, victims' survivors' aspirations for justice are beyond its limits and reined in by calculation, constrained by state and church interests, and affected by social inequalities. Inevitably, on this reading, we would expect justice mechanisms and practices to fall short, and by implication, larger justice aspirations to not be realized. But I could not leave it at that. That would be pretty depressing, wouldn't it? couldn't leave it at that. If justice aspirations cannot be fully realized, what can be realized are struggles for justice by individuals and advocacy groups. I like this approach because it puts emphasis on the process, and in particular, in terms of my line of work, the political conflicts between and among victim groups and state and non-state church entities. It also puts emphasis on the value of the struggle itself. And it gives attention to what has been realized, not what hasn't been, but what has been. A lot of the critical work often just looks at it doesn't measure up, it doesn't measure up. But what did it accomplish? And what is the struggle for? Well, in my area of institutional justice, the 4 areas that are of significance, and this is the case in other allied fields, are recognition, truth, accountability, and redress. Like the idea of justice, each aspiration has an elusive quality, not easily contained in a definition. Now, there's a lot more I can say about the framework, but it's time to close. I have this, again, reckless of me to do so, but a plug again for an article that just came out if you want to learn more about it. And it defines what each of those 4 aspirations are about. So I'm done, except I have to sum up and tell you what I've just said and give you a sense of the implications. So I made 2 major points. First, I said the term justice is used too loosely in academic writing on responses to wrongs against individuals, targeted groups, and large-scale victimization. And I would like to see this change. I would like to see us bring greater clarity and sophistication to argument and research on justice and injustice, not only in criminology and victimology, but also allied fields of institutional, transitional, and historical justice. And I've said we can do so by drawing from relevant philosophical argument, social theory, and empirical research. Now, I've not given you which philosophical arguments or which social theories. That depends on what your research is on and what you're looking at. I'm just giving a kind of a general overview of how I see it. The second major point is we should expect justice mechanisms and practices to fall short. Here, my message is have modest expectations. Now, the concept of falling short is certainly not controversial for formal criminal justice, for which the phrase comprehensive policy failure may be more apt. It can be more controversial for alternatives to criminal justice, to civil justice, to public investigations or truth-seeking, and to the redress scheme elements such as money payments and apologies. My message to have modest expectations is not that victims, survivors give up in advance. Rather, as Amartya Sen has put it, we go as far as we reasonably can. We go as far as we reasonably can. My concern foremost is ethical. Those who promote new justice ideas or who represent plaintiffs or claimants may oversell the benefits of mesoscale mechanisms and practices. This can be unethical, and I've seen it, and it concerns me. It leads to re-victimization of victims and a demoralization of advocacy groups and larger communities. So, I'm about to hit my 2 concluding sentences, but there's going to be something after, so just to let you know, something else is coming up. There's much to consider in this thing called justice, and I hope that my talk has provided or given you a chance to reflect upon your conception of justice and how you use the term in your work. That's been my goal. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you. But I said I had one more slide. Thanks. I want to show you this slide. It's by Gordon Siren, who's an Aboriginal artist. He painted this scene while he was serving a sentence in Long Bay Jail for murdering his uncle's adopted son. He served 10 years of a life sentence. And as you can see, it reverses the usual color of a courtroom, defendant and participants, with the defendant in white and all of the court workers doing meso-level justice in black. He was an artist before he began his time at Long Bay, and it was something he developed further while he was in prison. So I'm all done now. Thank you. Step down. Don't fall off your perch.
Thank you, Professor Daly, for a talk, and I think a historic first of a prologue. We are, Chris scares me. He says, keep it running, and I get scared. Thanks to all the recipients tonight, and thanks to all of those who make those moments of recognition possible. The people that do the work in the ASC to keep all of this machinery moving, the many mentors and colleagues who play a role in the production of the work that we often single out a single person, and we know it's a collaborative, collective achievement, and the recipients that embody the best of the American Society of Criminology 2024. Good evening.